Hello and welcome to our Education for All video series, where we'll be talking to a range of wonderful people about their experiences. Education for All is a campaign to help break down accessible barriers within the education system and to ensure that everyone has a future that they deserve. You can find all of the information and our campaign pack at www.horlicks.com. Today, we're joined by James White. James is a web developer for Nottingham College, and we've been lucky to work together throughout the accessibility project that they've just ran. James, welcome to the call.
Thank you very much, James.
Would you like to start by this call by telling everyone a little about your role and kind of where you've been in the kind of digital web world?
Yeah, so I'm the senior web developer at Nottingham College, as you said, and yeah, I kind of sort of oversee our sort of main college website, sort of some of our digital campaigns, email campaigns, all around in sort of the digital areas, and also getting involved in other, um, maybe not so digital but technical related elements, just part of who I am and my role. But yeah, accessibility has been a real focus for us for the past few years. And obviously really great to talk about it.
It was wonderful working with yourselves and the wider team as well. What was the reasons for approaching an agency like ourselves for this project?
Yeah, so obviously Nottingham College being an educational institution and obviously part of the public sector sort of bodies as part of the obviously the accessibility regulations that we have, we obviously knew that we needed to meet the obviously the guidelines outlined, but obviously we were very mindful as well that Nottingham College, obviously being one of the major colleges in Nottingham today, obviously after various mergers and different moving around, we obviously have a lot of students, and with that comes obviously a very diverse, audience. So it's obviously a very important thing for us to make sure that we are being accessible and meeting those requirements to obviously serve the Nottingham community and all our students, staff, visitors, and everyone else. So yeah, real key important thing that we were starting that journey with yourselves, and obviously yeah, we've learned a lot, and hopefully be able to explore some of that today.
Yeah, definitely. Was there a key reason why prioritizing digital accessibility was so important for the college? You've got obviously multiple facets, but was there maybe like a top three or a key priority we're looking at?
So obviously one of the key ones was, of course, the public sector regulations with the accessibility. Obviously, it came out in 2018. Obviously, new websites that were built then had to basically be accessible at launch. Obviously, those websites that obviously were technically not developed after that date obviously had to be retrofitted essentially, or you had to go through a process where they had to be done by a certain date. So we were in the latter side where obviously we already had an established website, but obviously it needed a fair bit of investigation, analysis, and then obviously then the focus of what we needed to do. Obviously working with yourselves to kind of outline that and yeah, really work through that. But obviously the other factor, in addition to obviously the regulations, of course, again was our mindfulness of the fact that the college is a very major sort of education establishment in Nottingham. It is one of the major colleges now after again being condensed with all the mergers. So our student count obviously is large. We have a lots of different sort of courses, mixture of levels from level entry level to almost degree level. So we've got a very sort of diverse sort of audience base that we really need to make sure that we were serving in the best way, particularly when they're accessing digital platforms, and obviously one of the most biggest digital platforms being the Nottingham College website. So yeah, that's kind of where we kind of came from, really.
Did you find that a lot of this was internal of your department, or was there push from higher up for the educational, sorry, for the accessibility factor to filter through?
Yeah, it was very much sort of, I think, on us to kind of be pushing it, because we were aware of obviously the accessibility requirements, obviously from the legislation perspective. So essentially, being part of the sort of the marketing team, that's where sort of our overall sort of digital sits within, from a marketing perspective. We were aware of it, and obviously we wanted to be proactive because we knew it wasn't going to be we can do it in a day. There's going to be lots of things. Our website's massive, so of course there's going to be lots to look at and different areas that need work and other bits. So it was very much being championed sort of within our department, but over time, I think we've been able to, not just be exclusively within our department. It's kind of trying to make it more a part of the organizational culture, and not just externally, internally as well. So it's trying to just really sort of push thinking about accessibility, and obviously some of the misconceptions of like obviously trying to make being more accessible means like more work, and all of these kind of misconceptions that when you actually break them down properly, it yes, it might look like initially there's more work, but actually in reality it's work that we need to be doing anyway, because we'd still have to create content. So of course you kind of then build it into your workflows and practices, and then all of a sudden it basically just becomes part of what we do generally. And then it's almost like not thinking about we need to make that accessible. It already will be accessible because we've already thought about it from the start. So that's kind of the culture shift that we've had, and obviously we're still on an ongoing journey of that, because again our organization is, as you can imagine, quite big. So you can't just influence change overnight, but we've definitely been able to build, I think, a bit of momentum on it, and more people are aware, and they're even asking the questions up front, like saying, is that accessible? Can it be better? Does this work? Sort of thing. So it's really good to kind of start something and then have it sort of keep going, without necessarily us having to keep pushing the fact. But we still obviously need to in some areas, because again, not everyone's aware, and it's more about education, not about obviously saying like this is wrong. It's about more educating and saying this could be better and this is why, and then using other perspectives and different audiences, and then this is where it becomes again just more of a knowledge type sharing, and just making people more aware. And awareness, really, it's kind of awareness and knowledge really are the two major factors of how accessibility is kind of important through everything we do, really. So yeah, it's kind of that's kind of the journey we kind of started on and continue to be on.
No, that's good. You mentioned culture, and culture is so tough to create, but at the same time, it's so rewarding to allow that flow to go through. And like you say, it's you're just doing a job, and making sure that accessibility weaves in. That is, it's the battle, and it's the battle that clearly is being won at the moment, which is great to hear.
Yeah.
So, before we came in and started this project, obviously did some brilliant work on the website, as it is now and still evolving. But how much knowledge did you have around accessibility within your project work, and obviously through the public sector? How I'll start that again. Sorry.
That's okay.
So obviously you've worked quite hard on the website. You can see the progress that's being flowed through, and it's always going to be continually growing. But how much knowledge did you have within accessibility before kind of we got started, and the public sector legislation as well? How much knowledge did you have of that prior to everything?
So we obviously were aware of the public sector legislation, because again, we're literally one of the prime candidates for it. Of course, education institutions, councils being the other sort of major one, but obviously any government controlled entity is essentially pretty much, unless there's an exception rule, you're under the regulation. So it's not as if it's a case of it's not a case you can't do it. You know it's coming. So we want to be really proactive about it, and really what I would say is we were certainly aware of like obviously the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium, of course. Being a web developer, religiously, looking at standards and obviously interpreting sort of all of the standards. Obviously, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, certainly was aware of it, but I would absolutely be honest and say that probably not as aware as I am now. Obviously, with the specific specifications of AA, AAA. Obviously, this was back when we did it under 2.1. 2.2 is now. I think it's now technically out, but I don't believe the public sector regulations are actually technically validating against it until later on this year, if I'm not mistaken. So, but again, that's going to be a refresh for us, because obviously we did all of our work under 2.1. Again, 2.2 probably not being as much of necessarily as a big change, but there's still going to be stuff in there that we're going to need to look at and be aware of, because obviously we're going to need to make sure we're complying to 2.2 now. And we are, funnily enough, we're just currently going through a website redevelopment project. So obviously from the ground up, it will have to be 2.2 now rather than 2.1. So we had a little bit of familiarity, I think, with some of the standards and stuff, but certainly didn't have probably as much as the in-depth knowledge and sort of able to just recall immediate, like, videos need to have captions, all of those things, and ARIA properties and everything like that off the top of my head, rather than having to really look at the guidelines and study them to understand. But obviously it's good to still look at them, because it's sometimes you have to remember, like, yeah, that's that, or it's no, it's not that, no. And sometimes it's one of the things you got to be careful of is trying to be accessible and then actually doing the reverse, like actually creating almost the opposite, because you've used a ARIA property in the wrong way, and it's actually caused a problem rather than actually fixed the problem. So still things to learn, and obviously keep sort of fresh in the mindset to interpret the standards properly. But that was kind of our sort of initial basis for that.
I mean, I think it's one thing to say is it's never wrong to reference. Always go back to the websites, code snippets that people find. It's impossible to remember it all, and I think this is why, as you say, it's going through and actually testing it and making sure that you can understand why it's being done, and bits like that, just to help that side. Really, it's vital on there. With kind of the redevelopment of the new website, how much is a factor of the work that we've done factored into kind of the decision process and the next phase of work, really?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think one of the main benefits of doing a website redevelopment project with this sort of already in scope in mind, and already going through this process previously, is essentially you build it in from the ground up, and immediately already start with what we need to do, straight from like the color palette, of course, like, that's not going to pass, minimum contrast ratio immediately out, so even at the design phase, we've already probably been annoying the agency we're working with by saying, that doesn't pass, that's not going to get through, that's not 4:5:1 ratio, that's not going to get through. So but that, it is sort of really important to kind of do that, and while retrofitting, which we did with obviously Hex Productions, it is easier to do it from the ground up when you've got that insight, because you just already know all of the pitfalls that you found in another website that you just don't need to do in a new website, and just redo it in a way that's obviously accessible from the ground up. And that in itself is kind of the principle, isn't it? Like, we've got these tools and frameworks and ARIA, but in reality, ARIA technically is not necessarily the you ideally should design something that doesn't need ARIA, because it should just be able to describe itself. Of course, there are limitations to that, but that is the principle, isn't it? You design it from the ground up and make it accessible from the start, and then you don't necessarily have to leverage as much as that, because you kind of you've done the hard work already. But yeah, it's definitely been really useful and insightful, because it's already probably identified, areas that, we do it this way because this will work and be accessible, versus doing it another way that might look great, but actually it doesn't necessarily structurally work at all. So the really important part was obviously separating visual and structure. And that's one of the first things that I kind of learned about when we went on our journey, is obviously being, a visual a user, suddenly having the other side and having a structure communicated in a way for a screen reader or narration is a complete eye-opener from a different user perspective. And that's been really useful to kind of, again, you look at a website not just exclusively on its visual now, you look at it as how it's structured, and then that communicates it, well as well. So that's been really, really helpful for us.
Would you say you were surprised with the results when we first did the audit?
Yeah, yes, I would actually, because I almost felt like I was a terrible developer. No, because
well, we've all been there.
It is, yeah. You've suddenly been very humbled, haven't you? Like, humbled in terms of obviously all of the lovely validation errors that came back on the initial audit was, a bit of a shock. You feel all of a sudden like, oh my God, I'm so terrible. I thought I was good at what I did, and then you get this. And to be fair, it's probably important of obviously other people going through this journey, or have been through this journey as well, can probably relate to it in the fact that often some of those validation errors are really like sort of just very tiny things that are just, you could miss them. And obviously that's why you do the validations, because obviously sometimes your own eyes fail you, or your own you just miss it because you just can't you just couldn't see it because you just completely just blinded by anything else or whatever. So the validation part initially was quite brutal in the sense of how many errors came back, but when you break it down, some of them are relatively minor. This could be very simple code fixes rather than like major structural issues. I think there was definitely like unclosed tags, which is obviously a really really basic one, but it slipped through because browsers are pretty forgiving these days on lax code, so you can kind of get away with it in some cases, but obviously structurally that's not going to work. So it does bring back, the simplest things are very important still to fix. Even just an open paragraph tag could have a massive impact on the accessibility of a page, and obviously you really don't want to be not scored down because you didn't close a paragraph for whatever reason. So the audit was humbling, but again insightful, because it did then show the need obviously to really start to look at components on an individual level, and how accessible things were. And you then, from that journey, it kind of then really gave us insight into sometimes forget the visual for a second, think structure, how components communicating without its visual, what's it describing things, how is it labeled. That then gives a real eye opener for obviously users that obviously use screen readers and aren't visually sighted. So that was really really insightful to do.
I mean, I have to say it happens to us all. When we have that first website tested, I think it feels like a therapy session. These conversations. So when I did my first website with the local authority, I worked really hard. We had to have an A to Z. It was the rules of the body at the time. So we created it. Thought I did a brilliant job. We took it to a charity to test. Straight away, a blind user with a screen reader said, "This is rubbish." I was like, it is, because now I can witness it, and it is rubbish. I've got to start again. But you say it's humbling, but then you learn from your experiences, and you become better, and you can teach that moving forward as well.
Absolutely, I would say that it was humbling, but then it's then something to be positive about, because all of a sudden you're gaining a lot of insight into a whole different audience that you probably would never have normally, because again, I don't use a screen reader obviously on a regular basis and narration software. But then when I was first shown it and how it was done and used by users that would do that on a daily basis, you can suddenly appreciate like, oh wow, yeah, that component really doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That must be so frustrating. And then suddenly having that eye-opening moment where you realize that, wow, this could just be so much better if I just changed a couple of things, and it would be a lot better for somebody else. And you like then you kind of get spurred on by saying, right, we want to make this better. This has got to be better, and that's kind of not to feel bad, but to humbled, but then suddenly gain all of this insight and a whole different sort of audience that you didn't necessarily have as much knowledge around, or how other users would engage with it. And then then going like, I need to make it accessible. It's like priority now. I need to make this accessible. So absolutely.
What did you find were the common barriers when we were going through the process, or the results, should I say?
I think the initial one was obviously interpreting some of the standards. The one thing I would say I've learned from accessibility is there is no clear sort of implementation. Well, obviously we do have obviously WCAG, which is great. It is obviously a great standard, and arguably I should say that while obviously we're talking about necessarily education and public sectors, I would argue that WCAG should technically be an actual law somewhere, in actual general law. It's great obviously that it's got into obviously public sector, because again, public sectors can't technically there is no other option to use like another council's website or another provider's website because they are the only provider of that service. So it does make sense. But I do feel that there is probably another conversation maybe later down the line that perhaps WCAG should be introduced into law. And I know obviously like other countries have also adopted WCAG, but with equivalent laws that aren't quite the same as maybe the public sector bodies one, but similar principles of a baseline of accessibility, which I think is absolutely what we should be going down the road of, because personally, I don't see why a private company can get away with not being accessible compared to a public sector. Of course, because we're government, that's the reason. But I don't see there should be a distinction there in the perspective of a user. It seems unfair that if a company that's private doesn't want to be accessible, shouldn't be brought up on that. Of course, there's other choices and other options when you're in the private sector, I guess. But again, it's still, I think, something to as a discussion point maybe in the future that I think we should consider something like that, because at the end of the day, it's to benefit audiences and users. So it has much more benefit than negatives in my view. But the challenges that we faced is really like the interpretation of some of the standards. Components can be made accessible in different ways, and there are different ways to do it. And there's also a little bit of, I think, just a little bit of variability on certain opinions as well. It can, what I would say is accessibility can be opinionated a little bit, because there is an open interpretation to certain parts of it, which can be technically interpreted as one way or the other. And we've got direct experience of that because we obviously worked with Hex Productions for a good couple of years to sort of get our accreditation. And then within a month, the government digital service appeared, came knocking on the door. They say it's random, these checks, but I'm pretty sure someone's watching, because there's. I mean, call me skeptical, but we put our accreditation sort of announcement on, I think, just before the new year a couple of years ago. It was just in December. Didn't really say much about it, and then we made a bit of a press release about it, and obviously published it on wider channels. And then all of a sudden, the government digital service comes knocking and says, "Hey, hi. See, you've got a accreditation, but we found some interesting issues which I think you should look at." And obviously, those weren't picked up in our audit by both, obviously, Hex Productions, and also we worked with, obviously, the Shaw Trust through yourselves. So it was interesting there, because obviously that wasn't picked up at all. But obviously, James did explain that obviously this can happen. It does happen. And there isn't an open interpretation. So that, again, is probably one of the most challenging parts, is interpreting some of it sometimes. But there's always a solution. It's just sometimes it's understanding what that solution is and implementing it properly. And I guess, yeah, the only issue there is just that variability, a little bit of kind of grey area interpretation of. Yeah. You can interpret it one way and the other, and technically both are right, but one will say it's not, and the other will say it is. So then you get this weird sort of little bit of a maybe discussion of like, well, I believe this is correct and this is why, and then you have that little bit of a friendly discussion. And that did happen with the government digital service. Like they I think flagged one area which we then didn't argue. I just said, well, I feel that this is actually, this because of that. And then they said, yeah, okay, we understand that, and we agree with that. So there is that still a little bit of a grey area of accessibility. But overall, I think the WCAG standard is pretty rock solid. And again, I think the government have chosen that standard for law because, again, why reinvent the wheel? But also it's an international recognized standard, and obviously the W3C do great work in setting web standards. So why create something else? So it's been absolutely really good.
That's brilliant. Right. Always comes at the wrong time.
Yeah, it's okay.
So as a developer, and you've gone through online learning, self-taught classes here and there, but before our training, and our sessions and everything we did. Have you ever seen firsthand of someone using a website with assistive technology and how they interact with the website?
Um, I hadn't really, to be fair. When we did some of the initial sort of audit parts with yourselves, you obviously showed us accessibility sort of tools, screen readers, narration, and stuff like that, and that kind of gave us the insight into obviously how a website is essentially read out and structured, and obviously the structure then has massive impact and can completely change the whole dynamic of how it's understood and interacted with. Um, I wouldn't say I'm obviously the best sort of user of those technologies because I don't use them enough to obviously do that. So I wouldn't want to say that I have a good understanding of that because again, unless you kind of use those tools on a daily basis, I don't necessarily think I could say that. But obviously, I have used them more compared to obviously what I would have done previously. So it is again good insight to have that, sort of refresher and understanding the other tools that people will use to browse websites. And obviously,
Mhm.
the really important point is remembering that obviously there are users that will use these tools all the time because that's what they need to do. Whereas obviously I have, that I can choose to use one or the other. So it's just being mindful, obviously, that that those tools are there for people that need them, all the time to obviously access websites and digital platforms. So it is good to use them, but having the experience of obviously using them constantly is not something I could say I do have. But I haven't witnessed firsthand necessarily somebody using those tools, but I have seen them on videos.
Mhm.
You've shown us obviously some clips of people doing it. We've also done. I think I attended one of some of the sort of the meetings you set up before, where there was people that obviously were speaking there and obviously used those tools. So again, I have had sort of that first-hand experience, but obviously not directly, so to speak. But again, really insightful and really opens sort of the mind of obviously what these tools are doing for those users.
Do you find? I mean, obviously we've kind of spoken about this throughout the talk, but actually understanding how people use assistive technology, has it changed the way that you develop or code when you kind of sit down and load up your editor? Are you almost seeing the matrix and like how that's going to be read out for people now?
Yeah, I think that's one of the ones that it's kind of been really insightful and useful is when you start writing code, you're suddenly writing it from not only what does it look like visually with obviously CSS and everything like that, but also structurally, does it make sense? Is this the best way to convey the structure? What's the heading order? All of those things suddenly now become sort of pretty much standard with writing any component. So maybe a couple of years ago, just be I'm going to write layout and it's going to be great and CSS and lovely, 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 and then you go no, start again, forget CSS for a second, forget the visual, think about the structure. If this was purely a read out from its structure, does it make sense? Does it convey the information in the best way? Um, can it does it need to be communicated anymore? Does there need to be any ARIA properties? Do labels need to have more context to them if we're not looking at it visually? Those types of things are just kind of like embedded in my head, which is a good thing because again, it's kind of the whole point is obviously it's not just about the visual, it's about the structure, and ultimately, if your structure is good, the visual is just a nice layer on top. In reality, now it's kind of almost seeing that the priority is the physical core structure of a website, and the visual is actually secondary. Whereas obviously maybe before it would be the other way around, where like the visual is the most important thing, and then the HTML is kind of like the boring part that sits underneath. But it's actually not; it's the reverse, and that's kind of the um, impact I think it's had on us is, and certainly myself is it changes your mindset of how you actually even approach even building a component or writing a new feature or whatever. It's kind of there from the start now, kind of like embedded in sort
Brilliant.
of everything we do. So yeah, absolutely, it's had a major impact.
I mean, this is always a tricky question because sometimes no news is good news. But have you received much feedback since the change from uh, a nearly accessible to an accessible website?
Yeah, I think to be fair, we haven't had direct feedback, but I guess it's one of those kind of yeah, no news is good news, but also uh, the way we look at it is obviously it doesn't really matter if we're not getting that direct feedback. We know that obviously our website is more accessible than it was, 2-3 years ago, and that means that more users are probably able to understand things better, interact with it better, and hopefully get to things that they want quicker. And it ultimately falls back into ultimately no matter what, no matter if we don't receive that feedback directly or whatever, um, we have definitely improved the journey and the experience. So that in itself is enough to know that obviously that's kind of there now. Definitely internally, I think the accreditation helped give sort of more visibility to it. Obviously, it's a really nice thing. We didn't have to go for the accreditation; it is an extra thing on top of complying to the general regulations. But obviously, Hex Productions are really keen on obviously us going for it because again, being a major college, knowing that we're a large college. It's obviously a really good thing to do and the right thing to do, and we were really on board with it from the start, and we were absolutely committed to going to it. So we were obviously really pleased when we ended up getting over the line after many challenges, particularly obviously lovely COVID, obviously disrupting the whole projects. We started I think in 2018 or 19, if I remember, and obviously we had that
Yeah.
COVID period where basically everything was just out the window, and the focus was literally just obviously operational, unfortunately. But we obviously restarted that, got it back up and going again, and then yeah, we finished it off and got to that sort of stage. So yeah, really. Yeah, long journey. Not necessarily needed to be
Mm.
as long as it was, but again, no one could have predicted a global pandemic. But once we resumed things, I think we kind of got things sorted and got really into the the deep the deep stuff that were obviously the most important stuff. And then yeah, getting that accreditation from the Shore Trust was obviously one of the most rewarding things, knowing that we've really had an impact, and yeah, we then carry that through into everything we do, and that's where it's
Mm.
kind of gone from really.
Yeah, having I mean it's good to test, and we know we all test as our agency as yourselves internally, but to have an independent like the Shore Trust test it as well, it's I think again it adds to the knowledge because we're all learning from everything that we've gone through. Nothing, they always joke that they're always going to find something wrong with anything that we do because that is the nature of what they should be doing. They should always be trying to find holes, and even if, as you say, when you had GDS, it's starting the debate, starting the conversations about why they believe something should be different and why you should believe. And if you can justify it and talk through it, they are, at the end of the day, they're guidelines. They're not how to dos. So I think it brings quite a lot in doing that. So that third party always helps on that side, which is wonderful. So once you've now got your certification, what would you say that you're now able to achieve now that you are an accessible website and have gone through all of these processes?
I would say we feel really confident, obviously, that if we needed to build, obviously, we are currently doing obviously our redevelopment project, but if we needed to build sort of any other, web-based platform or whatever, we'd obviously have, accessibility from the start in mind, and obviously make it, we'd know what to check for. We'd obviously know what to do scans, and one of the main things that I think that we want to really improve on is having accessibility built right into sort of the code deployment process, where you essentially have a validation that if something isn't accessible, it just stops being able to even go anywhere in terms of light to production or whatever. Um, there are tools to do that. Obviously, it is a bit of a complex sort of thing to set up and build into your pipeline, but I think that's kind of where we want to go, because we don't basically want to ship anything that's not accessible. So we really want to look at building that into our actual, even deployment sort of processes. So we can't even if we wanted to, we're going to get, it's going to say that's not accessible, that's failed the check, because you can run various sort of pipelines and processes to kind of almost do like sort of scans within checks, and you can almost mock templates out with essentially what the layout would be, and placeholders and stuff like that. And that's what we really want to potentially look at doing. Um, and the other aspect really is sort of um, trying to the other thing that we found sort of is you once you get your accreditation, it's maintaining it because you've got lovely
Mhm.
users. We love users, obviously, but we've got obviously people adding content to the website every day. Mostly, we're lucky in the sense that it's mostly controlled by us directly, so we kind of don't have the necessarily the free for all as other agencies or other organizations might have, like different people, different departments. Generally comes through one place, so kind of that's useful for us. We can generally control it, but we're not immune to obviously accidentally doing something that's not great or doesn't quite work. So it's having that maintaining that status and obviously having those sort of constant scans happening in the background. And there are tools that we can do with that, but it's kind of establishing those processes, I think, that kind of helps maintain a constant accessibility presence, because obviously once we've gone through the accreditation, technically that lasts for a year. So in reality, there is no scans or further checks, but we can run those ad hoc if we want to. But building those into our processes again is probably going to be really useful. And one of the big things that we're committing to in our redevelopment project is PDFs. We hate PDFs. I'm sorry. They were great once, and they're still useful for a certain format, but they're over abused, and it's really something that we're trying to stamp out in our organisation, because it's just a horrible format, and to make them accessible is absolutely horrendous anyway. And the government obviously recommends using essentially HTML formats wherever possible. So what we're committing to is obviously one of the most key things that PDFs usually end up on is like policies, classic policies. We are committing to basically converting every single one of our policies to a HTML version. So
Massive.
we're essentially trying to stamp out the problem because we've seen it. We know it's still
Mhm.
present in our current website. It's on our accessibility statement, but as part of our new website, we're literally trying to just say we're stamping them out because they are they're unnecessary in a lot of cases as
Mhm.
well. And it's just a very it's an old hat thinking like, oh, it needs to be a PDF. Like, why does it need to be a PDF? It's literally just text on a document. We can literally do a HTML version that will be much better, and everyone will be fine. And we, again, that's a culture thing because there's a lot of that still in our organization. We're trying to kind of push that, um, even using the government as the example. Like, look, the government is saying HTML versions are the future. We've got to look at this. Um, we're hoping that we'll stamp out pretty much 98%. There's going to be a couple that are going to be contentious, but that's internal politics. But
Yeah.
the majority will be, HTML by default. There is a debate of offering the PDF version. I still don't necessarily want to, because again, why have we gone and done that and then still offer it? But we'll see. That could be an internal fight or a little discussion. But yeah, that's again one of the big commitments to us that we kind of know from our journey, that we just don't want to deal with the problems of that format anymore, and we're committing to obviously just taking them out entirely and replacing them with something much better, and will offer the same value and engagement, but be accessible. So again, it's that commitment to kind of doing that, really.
I wish you the best of luck with that one. It's an easy challenge, of course.
It's going to be fun, but again, if I think we have to be bold sometimes to kind of
Yeah.
to really push change, because otherwise we'll never do it. And
Mhm.
you'll end up going through your accessibility statement every so often when you renew it and say, yeah, some of these PDFs still aren't accessible. And then you'll go through it again 6 months later, go, they're still not accessible. And then it's just going to keep going and going and going and going. So we're literally saying we're going to get rid of them. And then that way they're not going to be, almost a slight on our accessibility statement of everything else that's been done to say, yeah, structurally it's sound and everything's great, but these PDFs are literally bringing the whole thing down, and it's really annoying. So yeah, absolutely, we are. We're definitely committed to that. I mean, I would like to say for the designers out that PDFs obviously work for certain requirements, but they've been
Yeah.
over abused, and it's time to stop them. So
They have their place, as you
they have their
say.
place, and obviously portable document format for a reason.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, over time, what's happened is they've kind of been abused and misused, and then no one's really stopped and gone, "Why are we doing this?" And then finally, I think the government's gone, "Yeah, HTML is the future. Don't do that." So it's a good thing, because I think we we've got a bit of backup. We can cite the government and say, look, they're doing it, and they're our bosses high up in the chain. So we're essentially doing what they're doing. So it's okay. It's fine. We're not crazy. So yeah, it's going to be a challenge. But again, I think it needs that bold action to kind of really push forward the whole, this format is not suitable and we're not going to do it anymore. And once we stamp it out, then that will just, again, create so much more open formats and better experience for everybody. So absolutely, it's going to be big, but yeah, we're committed to doing it.
Brilliant. So, do you have any advice for kind of further education establishments out there who have not considered their platform's accessibility? What would be your advice to them?
So yeah, I would say about sort of other organisations sort of haven't gone through this process or looked at their accessibility is the first thing is to not be afraid, because it will be scary. Suddenly going through potentially years old parts of a website, potentially depending on how old it is, you're probably almost afraid to look of like what's hiding under there or what was done. Particularly obviously if for example you've inherited it from another client or another developer's left since or whatever. In terms of that is you're just going to have to brace for the initial report. Don't be scared, and don't necessarily be too surprised at some of the results that come back, because again, like we talked about in our conversation earlier, that some of the validation errors can be really basic and very, very simple, trivial issues, and a lot of the time some of those issues might be repeated across hundreds of pages because it's a template. So it says 100 issues, but it's actually one code problem that then gets fixed across the whole thing. So it's all about taking what the validation sort of result is, and then start to look at it, break it down. What are the low-hanging fruit issues, essentially, versus what's the big part, and then kind of start building out sort of the plan then. Because obviously the big stuff is obviously, if there's major structural issues, then that's going to have a massive impact on, current sort of, the website. Whereas obviously like one-line code changes or misuse of a ARIA property or syntax error like unclosed tags, easy enough to fix, easy enough to sort. Then you kind of clear the way for those big issues to then say, right, this is a problem. Like we can talk about our own journey. Like on our homepage, we've got a carousel. Debatable whether carousels, are beneficial. Funnily enough, we don't have a carousel on our currently in progress new website. So again, one of the new learnings that we came from this project was carousels we're going to get rid. So that was one of our pain points, because carousels can be notoriously difficult to kind of convey proper accessibility and structure. So sometimes, while it does seem maybe like you're giving up or defeating it, sometimes just because you can doesn't mean you should. And we've learned that from a few sort of components that we have in our current website, which we wouldn't necessarily do again in our new website. We still obviously had to make them accessible and adjust them, but in reality, they're not necessarily the best components in the first place to use. Regardless of accessibility, the carousel argument, for example, for visually sighted users, no one's looking after the first slide. Analytics says it.
True.
It's right there. Yeah. So why are we investing time in creating a 4-slide carousel when no one's really looking after slide 1? So it's those types of learnings that kind of help as well, because it almost informs patterns generally about design and UX and stuff like that. So but yeah, the main highlight is don't be scared. Think of it as a journey. But also realize that if your website isn't accessible, you are technically not necessarily making something usable for an audience, which absolutely should be considered. And the frustrations that user base may be having currently with your website is going to be a major barrier for them. And also on a brand perspective as well, like, you may have a user that chooses not to use services from a website that's not accessible because it frustrates them that much. I read a story recently about I don't want to name drop because it's not fair, but I think it was a ticket sort of website for gigs and stuff, and one service in particular wasn't very accessible, and a user was very upset because it was just a very horrible experience for them to use, and the frustrations of just trying to buy tickets to a music gig that they couldn't, and they had to have a friend help them, which that in itself to me is very heartbreaking, and that's kind of the principle of that's exactly why we need to look at accessibility, because you imagine if someone came to me right now and said I can't use the Nottingham College website because it's not accessible and I can't use it, it'd be really heartbreaking, I think, to hear that, and knowing that somebody couldn't apply for one of our courses because of an accessibility problem would be horrendous to hear. So that's absolutely why I think organisations should consider obviously looking at accessibility if they haven't already. And obviously, if you're a public sector, you have no choice. And I do believe, again, going back to the point earlier, that there should be, I think, maybe a discussion in long term, in UK law, that WCAG should be adopted for all digital sort of platforms that are sort of externally facing for usability, because it doesn't have any negatives. It's just benefits all the way. Yes, you can argue there's cost and development and whatever, but in reality, that development would still have to be happening to build it anyway. So it's just part of building it into your sort of processes and workflows, which is kind of, I think, the way to look at it. It's not an extra thing. It's not a hindrance. It's adopting something that becomes part of your overall working practices, workflows, strategy, thinking, everything, and all of a sudden it's just as one with everything else, and it doesn't become a burden, because obviously that's one of the key arguments. It becomes a burden, or like, oh my god, I've got to change all this, and we just don't have the time and resource. But it's like, don't see it as a burden, see it as a journey, and you'll be surprised sort of how much you can kind of build it into your existing practices, and all of a sudden it's no longer a extra thing that you need to do. It becomes as one with everything that you do, so it just naturally gravitates to that. And I think that's really important to stress, that it's definitely something to be celebrated and encouraged. And you've just got to do it, but don't be afraid.
Yeah, definitely. Now, James, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Really, really insightful. Obviously, we wish you the very, very best for the new website.
Thank you very much.
Sure, it's a lovely stress, but it's a lovely one to have.
Indeed.
So, no, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Take care. Thank you very much.